anyway, I'll start with that and see if my recollection is correct, Bob. But we both of us arrived at the Advanced Electronics Center of General Electric in Ithaca, New York. It was a small lab. My recollection was about 250 people, roughly.
Yeah.
And it was run by GE to support its military business. GE was big in the military business at that time, and this center was established near Cornell University. And mostly it was, you came in and you had little projects, research things to do, and people left you alone, and you did stuff.
Yeah, you got all of the dregs that the operating divisions didn't want to tackle,
Right.
and they'd offload them to the lab and say, "You guys solve this thing."
Right. We tried this, and it is, you need the help. So Bob, I arrived in July of 1960, and Bob, I think maybe September,
Yeah, fall
October,
sometime.
in the fall.
Right.
Bob had come with from MIT doing his master's work, and I had come out of the 4 years of the Navy. And so we got little jobs to do. And it wasn't very far along in there that some of the projects that we worked on brought us together. The group we were in, 13, 15 people, something like that, Joe Gallo's group.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a small group, a lot of respect, and it sort of free-flowing. But we ended up working on stuff together. And most of them were these jobs that Bob has remarked, where the operating department said, we got this mess here, see what you can do with this. And one of those things was a project, at the time, it was a funded project at the center from JANAIR, standing for the Joint Army, Navy, Air Force project. And their objective was to produce they referred to it as Highway in the Sky, I think, is that?
Yes, yeah.
Highway in the Sky. And the idea was to take the complex cockpit instrumentation in military aircraft, and all aircraft, I guess, and replace that with some kind of a heads-up display that the pilot would see that gave him attitude cues, altitude cues, and speed cues. And it turns out that the reason I think that the work was centered at the Electronics Center was James Gibson, who was a professor of psychology there, had done work in perception. And it was one of his ideas was that textual cues presented to a pilot could provide a lot of information in a very simplified form. Mm-hmm. And so the job of the laboratory and this JANAIR program was to take that idea and see if you could implement it in hardware that would let them then produce this Highway in the Sky thing. And we ought to jump ahead. Bob has one of these Highway in the Sky things in his iPad. Why don't you take it from there, Bob?
It took many decades to get there, but what was a room full of computers, which they actually flew in a test airplane run by Cal Labs, and they had two cockpits, one where a guy could look out and fly, take over and fly with the normal controls, and the other one was a guy that could fly looking at this display. And what they saw out there were a succession of posts, guideposts, and you would fly. And so looking at this one display, you could get all the information you needed that was normally provided by what's known as the six-pack with attitude and heading and altitude and so forth. And it was a few years ago where you could actually buy an app for your iPad that would provide even a better looking display of the same kind, used for emergency. If you ran into a problem, you started this thing up, it would find where the nearest suitable airport was and provide you guidance down to it, knowing something about the glide characteristics of your airplane if you wanted. And as a pilot, I found that fascinating.
So you jump back to 1960 when we came into existence at the lab, and this program was going. And so it was providing, and one of the things that they first tried to do at the center, even before 60, was they tried to make this display that Bob is describing using analog computing equipment. So it was analog computers drawing lines on a display, not like a television raster, but called a calligraphic display, a line drawing display. So they tried to do that, and it really didn't work very well at all because the computational accuracy of the analog computing was inadequate to provide the kind of information they needed, and the display was not really very good as a result of that. And so Purdy, a guy named Bill Purdy, who had been a psychology student under Jim Gibson, joined the lab with this background in perspective and texture and so forth, and he was in the little group that was a little different from the group Bob was in, Bob and I were in. But he joined that group to help them produce what ended up being the JANAIR system, which produced a digitally computed perspective image of a box, which was supposed to be an aircraft carrier on an ocean. So it had a plane surface, and I think it may have had texture, but I don't remember. Do you? It doesn't matter. It had something, and it had this box sitting there, and you would land your aircraft carrier on it. So that technology existed, and so some of the marketing guys said, let's go, this is great stuff, let's go market this stuff. And so they made a thing that they could take around the country in a truck. And it stopped at all the aerospace companies. And somebody, when they were going through Houston, said, well, there's this national space thing and so it's NASA, was just being formed then. And they drove their truck in there and put on a demonstration, and the NASA guys went wild. And they wanted to buy one of these things. And so the result of that was a contract which we won, and that's one that came into our group. So we had this, after doing some of these cleanup jobs, we had this thing in our lap which said, you have to produce this plane surface perspective picture of texture on this flat surface.
The only problem with all of that is when they say we'd like one just like that, it was always followed with, but we need this, that, and the other thing, that extended it well beyond that. And one of the things, they were using it as an engineering simulator, not as a training thing. And they were wanting to research various protocols for getting to the moon, landing on the moon, fuel protocols and all that sort of thing. So what they needed to do primarily was provide views for a very large altitude range where they started way above the moon, came down, and eventually landed. And so that created the need for very high dynamic range on texture, something that you could judge your attitude and your speed and that sort of thing. And so that created the need for these nested patterns, one of which emerged out of the other over 100,000 foot range or so in altitude. So that was one of many instances where the customer said, we'd like one just like that, but we'd like a few little improvements.
And it's the ... after the but that really introduces the fact that, this is wholly different. And Bob and I were instrumental in getting that thing. We got the assignment to get this thing going. And I don't remember, maybe I was the program manager or something.
I think so.
But we couldn't hire people very much, and so we both ended up doing a lot of design on the thing. I did the architecture of some of the stuff, and Bob did a whole lot of work on fixing problems that I had created through my naivete. on how this thing, how this thing should work. But I think if you have the picture of that in your mind, then fast forward because we were absorbed in that, and believe it or not, it was a job that it had a very tight schedule, and we actually started the work on that probably in would it have been late '61 or early '62? Early '62, and we actually delivered the thing in 1963, late 1963. And there are a lot of stories that come out of that. I'll tell you one that Bob will remember. But the equipment required an acceptance test. And NASA we had to write the acceptance test, and then they would come with all their people and witness the test and verify it. And Bob was our test conductor. He actually conducted the test. Bob smoked pipe at the time, and so he was sitting there at the console, and he would step them through. You see, this is what we're going to do. Now here's the result. You see that, smoking on his pipe. And we got to some place, and you may remember the details of this, but I will never forget the issue. I don't remember what the real detail was. He said, now when you push this button, this is going to happen, and nothing happened. and he said, and so in the next step you will see, and he went to the next step, and nobody said boo. And then after it was all over, we figured out what had happened, and there was some little glitch, and he got it fixed. But we actually satisfied their need.
All the boxes got checked.
Yeah, yep, they did, and we had in the process we had gotten to know these people, so they were our customers, and we were late on some things. I mean, when I think of being late on that program in a 2-year time frame and look at today and how things go, I think it was probably a miracle that we made it in time. But another story on Bob that I think is a fantastic thing, the calculation required to generate this perspective picture could be greatly simplified, had to be greatly simplified so that we could actually make it by assuming that this raster line that's drawing the picture is actually horizontal to the ground plane. If not, then you need to make a perspective division every element in the picture. And so we had to actually roll the raster of the display, and in this breadboard thing that they took around to sell the contract to NASA, they actually achieved that by sticking a motor and a gear on the yoke of the cathode ray tube, and it actually rotated the yoke so that the raster line, as though you're looking at your television display and all the raster lines are going like that. So to simplify the calculation, Bob developed some amazing displays that actually rolled the yoke electronically, and they required a megawatt of amplifier, that
Somebody gave me this little assignment and said, here's an interesting task, you think you'd like to book that? Why not? It's one of those things where you learn a whole lot
fast.
And ended up with these huge power amplifiers and mounted on cooling towers with fans blowing, and sensors would shut the whole thing down if there was any decrease in the airflow, because it would blow these transistors that were $100 a piece, and there were 30 or 40 of them in there.
It was an engineering marvel, actually. It was really good. So then the next jump, I think, is, well, how did we get NASA 2, right? Because had we, when we had this acceptance test, the guys were excited, and they said, oh, and by the way, we're going to use this for engineering simulation, and the plane surface is going to be interesting, but we got to dock with spacecraft, we got to land this thing on the moon. We need
dodge craters.
There got to be lumps on the ground, and so we need three-dimensional things. Can you do that? And I remember looking at the Janair stuff, and they had this box on the ocean, and I said, well, yes, there is and I talked to Bill Purdy a little bit about it, and he was told me how they were doing these things, and I said, yeah, we know how to do it. That is, we know the theory behind this, and we think we could do that, but we don't know exactly what the implementation's got to be. And they said, well, could you do a demonstration for us to show us what you think you could do and how that might work? And we said, sure. And so I think we invited them back in a few months after the acceptance test, the installation was still going on in Houston. And so they came back up, and we had made a thing that computed 3 edges of a triangle, and we took this red triangle, and we had, no, actually, this was before acceptance. I'm sorry, it's before acceptance, because we had the equipment there. Remember, we used it.
I don't remember where it is in that cycle, but I remember there was one triangle.
Yeah, and we actually had the equipment, so they came back up, and it may have actually been an acceptance test time. So Bob figured out how to compute using this kludge of stuff that we had for computing, which wasn't very much at the time, digital computing, and he computed how to actually fly this thing. So we flew this red triangle around the screen, and they, yay, that's exactly. Now, can you do a whole bunch of those? And we said, we don't know how. We believe that using, and we had looked a little bit at that, and we figured out that if you took the computing power that we had in this big special purpose digital computer, scaled it up to the point where you could make 240 edges, I think is what they were saying they thought they could get by with. It would fill rooms of equipment, would cost a bloody fortune, and you probably would be, hardly able to get them all checked out and working. And so we said, here's the risk, and that is we're going to have to shift technology now. Instead of using the kind of digital computing cards that we were buying from a vendor, we're going to have to resort to the latest integrated circuit technology to do this. There was something called Meckel 1. It was an emitter couple logic circuit that you could buy from Motorola. So we based our whole concept on being able to do this with Meckel. We looked at it, figured out that it would fit in a room, that we could build it for about what they thought they were willing to pay. And we embarked on what we refer to as NASA 2. And it was actually very hard because the Meckel 1 circuits didn't work. We were one of the first mass users of these circuits, and they found out that they didn't work, and we had based our whole thing on them. And so we were flying down to see Motorola, and they were embarrassed, and they worked with us, and they came out with Meckel 2, which worked. And I won't go into much of the detail there, but the thing was, it used, instead of using commercially available digital computing cards that had maybe 2 logic or 3, 4 logic gates on a little card, we had to have entire functional elements on a card. So we used multi-layer printed circuits, multi-layer back panels where these cards communicated with each other. And don't laugh, we were just exceeding the then practical speed limit. Our whole computer was operating at 5 megahertz. So, I'm embarrassed to say that in today's environment, right? But in any event, that's you know, that hadn't been done. And so we did that, and we eventually got it working. But we had these series of things where we would run out of money and time, and we would then make a little movie of what it was going to look like. And take it down to NASA, have a project meeting. They would spank us and say, well, okay, and give us more money and more time, and we'd go back, and then we'd get, I think we must have had about three such occasions, maybe more, where,
Survived it. Yeah.
and we survived it, and eventually we got it going, and delivered. Some interesting things that tie into this, to the thread of the story, would be, and I'm going to ask Bob to pick up on some of this, you know, make sure I'm getting it right. But the threads had to do with the fact that Ivan Sutherland and Dave Evans, who were professors at the University of Utah, where Dave had founded the computer science department there and had gotten gobs of money from ARPA at that time, DARPA today, I guess it's DARPA today, maybe it's gone back. Anyway, the Defense Projects Organization. He got a lot of money to do research in computer graphics, and got graduate students in a great program. They were thinking about forming their own company. We did not know this at the time, but they asked as employees of the university to come and see this marvelous thing that we had done for NASA. And so we gave them a tour through NASA, where they looked and saw it and so forth.
Yeah, I forget whether, did they arrange that tour, or did we,
They
showed up?
They
did.
asked us to arrange it, so I
Right.
set it up.
It's like 68 or something
It would
like
have
that.
been, it would have been 68 because, well, it would have been 68 because we delivered NASA 2 in 67, and they learned about it
Right.
then, and they were and then they founded ENS in October or something of 68. So they were in the formation stage, and they wanted to find out about this thing, you know, and well, what does that mean for us and our company? And so we arranged the tour, and Bob and I were there, and we had other people there, and they were very gracious
And also very curious.
Oh boy.
And there were lots of questions about, you know, well, how do you do that stuff?
Yes, yeah.
And I remember answering, you know,
Ivan.
I said, I think something, you know, I elaborated considerably by saying, I think we use vectors to do that.
Right. Yeah, Ivan says, well, how do you do this? Right.
And not knowing where they were going with all of this, I
Right.
was being a little cagey about it.
Yeah. Anyway, that was it.
But that started a relationship with Dave and Ivan and the work that was going on out here. And I started looking at some of the work that was being done by Dave's and Ivan's graduate students, and found some of it interesting. And that collaboration continued. And in fact, Rod and I got invited out to come to a thesis defense of one of the graduate students. And
John Warnock, who is known, actually he's not active, I think, in Adobe today, but John founded Adobe out of some of the stuff that he was doing. He was actually, we'll come back to this, but he was actually an ENS employee for a while and contributed some interesting stuff to the story. We'll continue. But Warnock and then Catmull.
Ed Catmull, whose main contribution was putting texture on three-dimensional objects. And I came out for that and found that fascinating. They were more interested in doing interesting textured, rich pictures rather than real time. So that's where their focus was. And I looked at that and said, boy, that's really nice stuff, but to try to do that in real time, that's way out there. But that continued a relationship that that eventually led to our getting together with Evans and Sutherland. And,
Yep. So if you go back then to the launch of the public announcement of the NASA 2, that gained, we were sort of under the radar for most of that, the first part of that story. But we got national press attention as a result of the NASA delivery. And one of the people who reading this press announcement was the guy that ran the outfit in Florida. It was called the Apollo Support Department, ASD. It was a GE organization that had a contract to do all the NASA support and so forth, but mostly it was support of flights, the flight operations and so forth. And they learned that these renegades in this little laboratory, at that time we had moved to Syracuse by that time, not a important element in the story other than we got from Ithaca to Syracuse, and we were doing our work there in Syracuse. And in fact, I don't remember, I think the NASA, in fact I'm sure the NASA 2 acceptance was in Syracuse because we were out at the Broad Street plant then.
well, and I think there is a relevance there in that moving to Syracuse plopped us in the middle of the heavy military electronics division, and we didn't really fit very well there.
Right, that's right. We occupied part of one of their plants, and we were sort of stuck off in the side, and they'd walk around us. But I mean, it was I don't know that there was anything that rubbed off there. I thought we fit in well at the lab, at the E-Lab, when we were housed in the E-Lab building there. But when they put us into exile, we were just sort of out there on our own. Anyway, I've lost the thread. Oh, we got the attention of this Apollo support department, who said, "Wait a minute, that's our stuff. Why are these guys being allowed to do any simulation work?" And they actually got us banned. It was a corporate edict that the laboratory would no longer, because we were out selling our own contracts, doing our own stuff. I mean, we were sort of...
It was based on survival.
We survived. We survived. And they said, no more simulation. And we looked at each other and said, our group then was maybe 15 people, I think, about. And we'd done all this stuff, and we're good friends, and we liked what we were doing. And we thought, how the heck are we going to survive, if they cut that off? And so, but it was sort of a shock to have that, because we'd had such freedom to roam and do stuff before, and we got our lifeblood cut off. Well, Bob, see if I pick this up right, Bob at the time was very interested in the generation of realistic, mathematically correct display of fog, low visibility. And he did a lot of work on that, and to demonstrate it, he made a movie of a landing under foggy conditions and showed how it all worked, and showed it at a conference. You wrote a paper on it. Did you present that at SIGGRAPH? Do you remember?
It's an SID.
It was SID.
SID conference.
Okay, so you probably did present it then. Yeah. Anyway, it was a marvelous thing. In the production of that thing, we said, well, this is a computer-generated thing. We ought to have computer-generated titles. And so one of the guys said, oh, I think I know how to do that we had this little equipment that we made the movie with, which was fairly general. You could program it to do a lot of stuff.
Non-real time.
not in real time, very slow.
Frame at a time.
It was cheap.
Yeah.
We had, it would do like, I don't remember, what, did it do 24 inch? I think it did. I think we took a NASA 2 module, an edge generator thing. It would do several of those. I forget how many, but,
Yeah.
and then we would compute the picture, a frame, sort of taking a page out of the researchers who were doing really good looking stuff that took forever to compute. Well, we computed a lot faster with this stuff, and then we would store it out on a digital disc and then run the movie. And so, I forget the guy's name. It may pop in sometime in the discussion, but he was a young programmer, and he said, "Oh, I think I know how to program this to make the alphabet." So they made the computer-generated titles, and apparently the paper got some publicity, and there were people there, again I don't remember the company, and I refer to them as the Three Wise Guys. There were 3 guys who ran a company in New York City that was generating weekly. They were generating slides that showed the financial performance of the financial institutions that had ordered the service, and they would produce these slides. And they were doing it manually with real, in the old-fashioned
Pen and ink.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And they were at this conference, and they saw it, and they called up and asked me if they could come visit us. Well, the reason I called them the Three Magi's is we were about ready to go home for Christmas that year, and these 3 Jewish guys walk into the lab, and they are introducing. You want me to
Yeah, please.
stop? Okay. Well, the phone can ring.
If you could start at the reason I called them the Three Magi. That's where we can start right there. That'd be
All right.
great.
So let's see.
Well,
what
the Three Wise Men or the Magi?
Well, but the Three Wise Men, I call them interchangeably,
Okay,
sort of,
yeah.
because it was the day before Christmas. They're Jewish, tall, good-looking guys. They walk in, and so did you answer it?
No, I just put it on mute. I don't know if that worked.
Oh, okay. Would you look at the handset
Okay.
and see if it's a call? It could be Rhonda or something like that, and maybe you could return it for us. Anyway, so you want me to start with what the reason we call them the Three Wise Guys was it was Christmas, and they appeared from the east, right, and wanted to know how we made that alphabet. They said, and they told us about their business. We would like you to make charts and graphs and things for us, and we'll send you the date. So they said, can you do that? And we said, yeah, we can do that. and we didn't, going from, putting a title line on the movie, we had to go to making charts and stuff. So we worked on that, and we sent them some samples, and they were very, very excited. And we ended up making, we were trying to survive, and we ended up making a little business out of that. It was not generating very much, but it was enough so that they weren't kicking us out of the lab or anything. And so we started that, and I'll shorten it by saying it ended up, after we left GE, we'll come back to that. After we left GE continued that work, and it became something which GE called Genographics. And you may be familiar with that. It was a slide making service that you could go online and get your slides made. So it ended up doing that. But that was not, we didn't have that vision for it. We were just trying to survive, and these guys were willing to pay us money for making these slides. So anyway, the issue here now is that we've been blocked from simulation. We've got this thing which is not going to keep us alive, or at least we didn't think it was going to keep us alive. So Bob and I started a campaign that was aimed at trying to interest GE in taking the technology which had up to that point been large, expensive, one-of-a-kind things that were delivered to people like NASA. And Bob, being a pilot, You were fine, you had your
Oh, yeah.
license then.
Yeah.
So Bob, being a pilot, said, you know, we ought to go after this commercial airlines because there are a lot of them, and they really do need training, and this stuff really ought to work. So we started producing some material that we took around, visited, you went, I went, we went to places, and we'd go in and we'd show them ideas about how we did you did a movie using this research facility that we built. You did a movie of a Hancock
Yeah, Hancock is the local airport at
landing,
Syracuse.
right?
And did an approach and landing and takeoff and even taxiing into the terminal to try and get the airlines interested. And every time we showed it to them, they'd look at it and they'd say, well, that's really interesting. Why don't you come back when you've got something that's a little less cartoonish and more real? And
Patting us on the head, saying,
yeah. And with the cost of doing even what we were showing very high, there was just no way we could approach that market at that time. But we kept the interest up in pursuing that, and there were later events that let us get into that business. And I think that was kind of jumping ahead a bit there. That was one of those cases where it turned out if you took a giant step downward in what you're trying to do, but solved a real problem, that you had a product. And the product there was a system that generated nothing but light points to show a runway and environs at night. That was it. And it turned out that the airlines could do significant training with just that much. So do away with all this expensive 3D stuff that was so hard to generate, and make that system. And it turned out, and put in things like low visibility ceilings, fog, and primarily what the airlines were training in was familiarity with the airport and its runway layout, which you could get just by looking at lights at night, and making the appropriate decision at the go, no-go point on approach. Do you have the appropriate visual cues that are required to continue that approach or not, and go on? And so giant leap backwards, solved a real problem, spawned a wonderful business.
yeah, yep.